Hello, everyone, and welcome to another one of our Avatar Bible studies. Today we are in episode 10 of Book 2, The Library, and under some careful delegation, it obviously led me in a few different directions, picking out what to discuss with you all here today. For the sake of time, I want to focus on one key detail in particular. If you could turn to the book of Ecclesiastes chapter 7, I'll be jumping around there, and perhaps if you are looking for something good to read today, that you can call this chapter very much Iro influenced. There are some great series of advice in here. But as far as what we'll be discussing here today, the verse that I want to set the theme for what I want to focus on with all of you in discussing the biblical themes found in today's episode is going to be verse 29. So the very end of the chapter of Ecclesiastes chapter 7. Truly, this only I have found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. This is a very wise observation by King Solomon at the end of his life, and his basic point was not only following a very long chapter of great points, but concerning the issues that we deal with in life. For example, the chapter starts with the place that we would find more perspective than anywhere else. Verse 2 says, "Better to go into the house of mourning than go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth." So you learn more from pain than you do from pleasure. You gain a deeper perspective from death than you do from, say, a birthday party. Now, another example, just for the sake of, while we're reading extra verses, verse 8 says, "The end of a thing is better than its beginning, the patient in spirit better than the proud in spirit. Do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. Do not say, 'Why were the former days better than these?' if you do not inquire wisely concerning this." It can obviously be discouraging when you see and hear over and over again people making the same mistakes. The philosopher George Santayana once observed that if we've learned anything from history, it's that man learns nothing from history. Solomon said it first around 1800 years before his lifetime. So that said, relevant to today's episode, and by the way, that previous passage, that'll tie into next week's study, so look forward to that. But regarding today's episode, there's one observation in particular made in this chapter that I want to draw attention to through today's episode, and that was ultimately this. What was the knowledge spirit's problem with giving Aang knowledge? Well, on top of our first verse, I think it can be also stated very plainly in verse 20. "For there is not a just man on earth who does good and does not sin." Now, sin is kind of a cringy word for some people because it's used either to manipulate, to isolate or control ideas that they personally don't like, but that wouldn't specifically be what that word actually means, what the Bible would describe as sin. So regarding this issue of sin, and note there are obvious examples of it, Admiral Zhao and the Sandbenders to name a few, but there are also more subtle examples of sin that we perhaps wouldn't consider to be the case. Sokka, Toph, Aang, Katara. But when it comes down to it, I don't want to just throw out the word sin and they say that settles it. I want you all to understand not only what the word means, and of course why it's a problem, but how do we solve this problem? And interestingly enough, this episode gives us a good highlight and format for that. So starting with the first and most important issue, what do I mean by sin? What does the word itself mean? When we go to the origin of the term, we can probably figure out what they meant by it, because words mean things. Well, here's my little offering of knowledge for your library. It's actually an archery term. If you hit the center of the target, what's called the bullseye, you accomplish the goal of archery. Someone who didn't hit that mark, in any sense, whether it was not even hitting the target in any way whatsoever, or if you were this close, they called you a sinner. In order to then understand that in a biblical sense, or in a moral sense, we say that we're a sinner, and that usually means that we're imperfect. And in a sense, that's accurate, as long as you understand that the goal of morality is what's key. What am I aiming for? What is that bullseye of morality? Who is the perfect moral standard through which all of mankind can determine universally and realistically what is right or wrong. Some people say it's my own opinion, some say it's my culture, some say other things, but when it comes down to it, if you don't want to end up in an incoherent system or a system that changes every other hour, then you have to make it objective, grounded in someone that doesn't change by nature and has to be, by definition, good in order to maintain that identity and status. Therefore, the real problem of sin comes to light, because I'm sure you've concluded that I'm talking about God. Someone by nature who is good, and then whose unchanging nature could form as a solid bedrock for what we would call good and not good, thus evil. We have to basically come to the conclusion, so what's the problem with being not good? And you kind of hopefully don't have to go into too much detail, but I'll do it anyway. When we talk about sin, in particular original sin, going all the way back to the book of Genesis chapter 2, how did we get into the world we live in today? What is wrong with this world? The simple answer is us, but that is, of course, oversimplifying it. It's like the meme from WandaVision, an oversimplification of events, but accurate. Genesis 2 describes our origins with an intention in mind. We were created in the image and likeness of God. We've clarified in previous studies, just to recap, the image of God means that we were meant to reflect his characteristics. He's spirit. He doesn't have physical traits. So if we were to say God looks like us, we have the wrong idea of image. When we see reflections of people, we see that's like, just like with this study, I'm saying it's like the Bible, not in that you take Avatar, put the transcript into a book, and you've got the Bible. No, I'm saying that it shares the same characteristics. It's like it in its image and its likeness. So if I ask myself the question then, what if I don't do that? I was originally created. We were all originally created to reflect the image and likeness of God. Well, if I don't do that, then what has happened? I'm not doing the thing that I exist for. That's a problem. Not just functionally, because you wonder, what else are we going to do than what we were made for? That's how you break things, by the way. You do things with them that they weren't built to do. But also note as well, we understand why there are such serious consequences for violating God's moral standard. We see things like evil and recognize that as not right, not just because there's just something gross about it innately, but even more importantly, we see just how badly those kinds of decisions impact us in a social sense, in a structural sense, meaning if I violate God's nature and that I don't commit suicide, it will result in my death. You get the point. So self-destructive or destructive, self-centered rather than God-centered, all these things are a not God attitude, which is why the New Testament authors, Paul the Apostle specifically, use the glory of God, the weight or the majesty, the beauty of God as the goal that we fell short from. Romans 3:23, for all have sinned, Solomon's point, and fall short of the glory of God. Now, a good example of this in today's episode would be noting the reason why the knowledge spirit didn't like visitors. He made the rightful assumption that Solomon did in knowing that knowledge will be abused, especially if we're the ones using it, right? It won't be used the way that it was intended to. The fact that there would be a solar or lunar eclipse, for that matter, would not fail God's moral standard in any way. Knowing that the signs in the heavens are going to be this and that doesn't change anyone's life in a negative way. But the fact that information would be used to attack the Northern Water tribe in such a way where they couldn't defend themselves, and how it was now going to be used to do the same thing to the Fire Nation capital, that's where it becomes a problem. Intelligence, knowledge, that isn't the problem. We are. The nature behind it, the hand that's holding the weapon, is the issue. In fact, that's why the first sin was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Not because knowledge is wrong, but note, what was Satan's temptation in Genesis chapter 3? You will be like God, knowing good and evil. So note, God already determined what was good and evil, but by taking that right on ourselves, We now have ideas like subjective morality. We come up with our own versions of good and evil and end up with things like socialism and Nazi Germany and every single other thing that's wrong with this world in a governmental sense. We see the abuse of people on individual senses. We decide, well, it's right for me to manipulate you because it gets what I want. Understand, as rightly observed, thousands of self-centered rather than God-centered acts are what are rightly described as destroying our world. So noting that then, if we take it on ourselves to do what only God can do right 100% of the time, we see everything wrong in the world summed up in one sentence. So then taking it from there, how do we solve this problem? Well, remember, we started with Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But you would also note that that's not ending in a period, that's in the middle of a sentence, which he goes on to clarify. The short answer is, how do we fix this problem? Not on our own. We are as incapable of saving ourselves as Aang and Toph were in saving Appa. In Aang's case, he didn't know that Appa was being kidnapped. Or flying bison napped, I don't know. On the other hand, Toph wanted to do the right thing and save Appa, but she couldn't. That's the library sink, and you kind of remove the whole reason why you'd want to save Appa in the first place. So whether we're in a situation where we're aware of our problem, Romans 2 style, or we're in a situation where we aren't aware of our problem, Romans 1 style, Romans 3 brings them both together in this conclusive point. Romans 3 verse 24. Remember, this immediately follows after the same observation Solomon made in Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 20. Being justified freely by his grace, meaning innate goodness, through the redemption that is in Jesus Christ, whom God sent forth as a propitiation, a ransom, by his blood, through faith to demonstrate his righteousness, meaning his right relationship with God. Because in his forbearance, God had passed over the sins that were previously committed. Notice, to demonstrate at the present time his righteousness. God didn't smite everyone who ever sinned ever with a lightning bolt. He allowed us to see just how bad we are, so that we would see how good he is. And note that he might be the justifier and just. Notice that. Just and the justifier of those who have faith in Jesus. So note, and here's a good example that I'll just conclude with you all on. Imagine if, and this is an if, Wan Shitong had flown everyone out of the library instead of flying after them in the library. Imagine if he took it on himself to take care of the sandbenders and maybe give everyone a ride to Ba Sing Se to intercept Azula while we're at it. Next episode, right? What would that show? Well, first of all, we understand why he didn't do that, because Aang, like Admiral Zhao before him, had done something that would deliberately violate his relationship with the owl, or the knowledge spirit. I know he turns into a snake, and there was another theme that I could have talked about there too, but you get the point. If I violated my relationship with not only someone, but someone in power, a very significant spiritual entity, it's under no obligation to help me out and solve my problems, especially the problems that I caused and created with it. He had one rule, that you wouldn't use this to get one up over on other people. And Sokka, and being the loudmouth that he is, we love him, but no, kind of blew it here, revealed that he was lying to the knowledge spirit. So what did he do? Well, he can't be expected not only to solve the problem, but now there is a problem between them. The only reason, or the only way, that that owl, the knowledge spirit, would even have bothered to care, let alone resolve Aang's issues, was if he was merciful and so good by nature that he would do good by people, even if they weren't good to him. I wonder if that sounds familiar. Thank you for your time and listening to this study. If you have any sincere questions or want to know more about these topics, please leave them in the comments below. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, you know where to go. But most importantly, if you know someone who perhaps has seen this episode but not perhaps looked at it through these or with these themes in mind, please share it with them. Thank you for your time. Remember that Jesus loves you and that he is that good spirit. That while we were the ones who sinned against him, we were the ones who violated not only the purpose of our existence, but have done things that have directly dishonored and rightfully upset him. And yet he was good to us, and yet he was merciful to us, and yet he solved the problem with his own life, what we created. So note that by contrast, when we're talking about God, we're not talking about Wan Shi Tong. He doesn't know 10,000 things. He knows all of the things, including everything that you and I have done against him. And yet he's just that good, that he would not only continue to be the definition of good itself, but demonstrate that in a moment of history by ransoming us from the problems we created. Well, that leaves me with nothing else to say, but thank you, God bless you, and we'll see you next time.